What's up everybody? Welcome to the video. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. Former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, airline pilot flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. I've covered bunker busters piece by piece across several videos on this war. So today I want to pull it all together into one clear picture. Every confirmed and reported use of these weapons against Iran, what they actually are, and how the strategy behind them has evolved. The first and most significant use came during Operation Midnight Hammer. 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers dropped 14 GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators, 12 on Fordow, 2 on an underground portion of Natanz, while submarine-launched Tomahawks hit surface infrastructure at Isfahan separately. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said the weapon's development against Fordow specifically had been 15 years in the making, with officers studying that exact target for over a decade. The technique involved sequential drops down ventilation shafts, the first weapon forcing open the cap, subsequent weapons traveling deeper before detonating, with one reserve weapon per shaft. Officials said every weapon reached its intended point, with severe damage assessed across all three sites. The GBU-57 itself is a 30,000-pound guided penetrator, about 20 feet long, capable of punching through roughly 200 feet of earth or 60 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. It's carried exclusively by the B-2, the only aircraft certified for it. A less publicized second use came out through Wall Street Journal reporting B-2s dropped a GBU-57 on an IRGC regional headquarters, reportedly in Tehran's Jamaran district. After CENTCOM developed actionable intelligence that senior IRGC leadership was meeting inside an underground bunker, this happened within the same operational window as the daring rescue of a downed F-15E crew member, Operation Epic Fury, which I covered in one of my earliest videos on this war. Roughly 102,000-pound bombs were also dropped to keep Iranian forces away from the extraction site during that same mission, meaning bombers were simultaneously covering a rescue operation and striking IRGC leadership. There's also Taliban 2, a facility within Iran's Parchin complex, where satellite imagery showed impact points consistent with a MOP-class weapon back in March. Israel publicly claimed credit for that strike despite not possessing the GBU-57 in its own inventory, and neither government has ever fully clarified what munitions were actually used. I've treated that one as unresolved rather than confirmed throughout my coverage. More recently, B-1 Lancers began flying openly from RAF Fairford in the UK, carrying a different, newer weapon entirely, the GBU-72 Advanced 5K Penetrator, capable of punching through roughly 150 feet of earth, plus mini-MOP JDAMs fitted with BLU-1019 warheads. Unlike the B-2, the B-1 isn't stealthy. In flying it openly into Iranian airspace signaled that air superiority had been sufficiently established, at least over western Iran, to make non-stealth bomber operations viable. This represents a genuine strategic shift, trading maximum per-weapon penetrating power for far greater quantity and platform flexibility, since a B-1 can carry 24 weapons per sortie against the B-2's two-bomb GBU-57 loadout. The GBU-57 exists in extremely limited numbers, with a Boeing replenishment contract not delivering new units until 2028. Having used it at least twice, possibly a third time, that stockpile is genuinely thin. The GBU-72 and mini-MOP approach gives planners a scalable alternative for the broader universe of hardened targets, missile tunnels, command bunkers, weapons facilities, while reserving the full-size GBU-57 for the very hardest targets, most notably Pickaxe Mountain, the facility near Natanz, buried an estimated 330 feet down, deeper than Fordow, which I covered in detail in an earlier video and which remains the one piece of unfinished business from this entire bunker-busting campaign. General Kane addressed something important at that Pentagon press conference following Midnight Hammer. The GBU-57 is fundamentally simple in construction, steel, explosive, and a fuse, but the real sophistication lives in that fuse programming. Each weapon used at Fordow had its fuse bespokely programmed for its specific role in the strike sequence, so it would achieve a particular intended effect rather than just detonating on impact. That level of customization is exactly why this weapon can't be mass-produced and stockpiled the way a simpler bomb can. Every unit essentially needs bespoke configuration depending on the specific target, which is part of why Boeing remaining the sole qualified manufacturer functions as a genuine bottleneck rather than just a contracting footnote. It's worth understanding what it actually takes to fly these missions. The B-2 fleet operates exclusively out of Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, meaning every single strike against Iran starts with a flight nearly 14,000 miles round trip. That's not a platform built for rapid response missions the way a forward-deployed fighter squadron is. For the second dynamic strike against IRGC leadership during the rescue operation, that logistics reality means CENTCOM either had meaningful advance warning of the leadership gathering or had B-2s already pre-positioned and on alert, specifically anticipating an opportunity like that one. Either way, it represents a remarkable degree of sustained operational readiness. Iran's government has publicly warned that some GBU-57s used during Midnight Hammer may not have fully detonated as intended and could remain lodged inside the damaged nuclear sites, with Iran's foreign minister specifically citing possible radiation exposure risk given how close these weapons are engineered to detonate near enrichment infrastructure. Analysts note unexploded ordnance from a penetrator. This large can result from fuse malfunction, a suboptimal impact angle, or unpredictable subsurface geology, and safely recovering or disposing of an unexploded 30,000-pound weapon buried under reinforced concrete is exceptionally dangerous under the best circumstances. It's a risk that applies to any GBU-57 strike against any hardened target, not just the nuclear sites specifically. The IRGC bunker strike fits into a well-established military doctrine, targeting concentrated enemy leadership directly rather than just equipment and infrastructure. The logic is straightforward. Removing a significant concentration of experienced leadership in one moment degrades an organization's effectiveness far more severely than destroying an equivalent value of equipment. CENTCOM had already destroyed the IRGC's own headquarters back in March, explicitly describing it as cutting off the head of the snake. So this bunker strike during the rescue operation was a continuation of that same strategic approach, executed dynamically rather than against a fixed, pre-known target. The B-1B is not stealthy. It can be tracked by radar over the target area, unlike the B-2. Flying it openly into Iranian airspace, with ground crews loading bunker busters in broad daylight at RAF Fairford in full view of media cameras, wasn't an operational security failure. It was almost certainly a deliberate message. It tells Iran's leadership that America's bunker-busting capability now extends well beyond the small, scarce B-2 and GBU-57 combination, directly undercutting whatever assumption Iran might have been operating under about the limits of that capability, while fortifying facilities like Pickaxe Mountain. World War Wings reported the B-1s will almost certainly operate over western Iran specifically, where weeks of dedicated air defense suppression created a permissive environment, while eastern Iran has seen far fewer strikes and likely remains too risky for non-stealth operations without further suppression work. The clear advantage of the GBU-72 and mini-MOP approach is availability. A B-1 carries 24 2,000-pound weapons per sortie against a B-2's 2 GBU-57s. These smaller penetrators are almost certainly cheaper and faster to produce than the specialized low-rate GBU-57. But the limitation is real too. It's genuinely unclear whether these smaller warheads carry enough power to defeat the deepest targets. A weapon punching through 150 feet is a serious capability against many hardened targets, but Pickaxe Mountain sits an estimated 330 feet down, well beyond what repeated GBU-72 strikes could plausibly reach in a single engagement. That suggests this diversified approach is aimed primarily at the broader universe of hardened but less extreme targets, while the single hardest target may still ultimately require a dedicated GBU-57 mission. It's worth dwelling on that 15-year development timeline General Kane described, because it tells you this wasn't a weapon rushed into service for this specific war. The GBU-57 program was driven from the start by the need to hold one specific target at risk, Fordow, built deep into a mountainside precisely because Iran calculated that depth alone would make it untouchable by any conventional weapon. Individual officers reportedly studied that target for over a decade, tracking the geology, watching construction as it happened, mapping every ventilation shaft and access point, long before any decision to actually strike it was made. That's an extraordinary intelligence and engineering investment sustained across multiple presidential administrations. And it's exactly why Midnight Hammer succeeded as cleanly as it did. The strike depended on knowing precisely which access points to target based on that entire decade and a half of dedicated study, not just raw explosive power. I've flagged this in several videos, and it's worth restating clearly here. The Air Force awarded Boeing a sole source contract since Boeing remains the only qualified producer of this specific weapon class, specifically to replenish the inventory expended during Midnight Hammer. That contract is valued at more than $100 million, though the exact figure remains redacted, and deliveries aren't scheduled to begin until January 2028. If the original strikes expended 14 units, and the second IRGC strike consumed at least one or more additional units, that's a meaningful chunk of what was almost certainly an already very small standing inventory, used up well before any replacement arrives. Air Force officials themselves warned that any delay in this contract would directly affect operational readiness within Air Force Global Strike Command. Add in the fact that the B-2 fleet itself has never numbered more than a couple dozen aircraft at any point in its service history, and you're looking at a genuinely thin margin on this entire capability, exactly the kind of constraint that likely explains why the B-1 and GBU-72 diversification became necessary in the first place, rather than optional. People often confuse the GBU-57 with the MOAB, the mother of all bombs, but they're built for completely different jobs. The MOAB, officially the GBU-43, carries a larger overall explosive payload and is designed as a blast weapon, meant to detonate at or near the surface and create a massive above-ground pressure wave, the kind of weapon used against troop concentrations or targets spread across an open area. The GBU-57 is the opposite philosophy. It actually carries less total explosive material, but nearly the entire design, the weight, the hardened steel casing, the guidance system, is built around penetration first and detonation second. So the explosive charge goes off in exactly the right place deep underground rather than uselessly at the surface. Two very different bombs solving two very different physics problems. The basing situation behind the B-1 deployment is its own diplomatic thread worth understanding. RAF Fairford has functioned for years as one of the few European bases capable of hosting America's heaviest bomber aircraft, and Britain initially declined to let the US use it for strikes against Iran. That changed after Iran struck an RAF base in Cyprus with a drone, prompting Prime Minister Keir Starmer's government to reverse course. That sequence is worth remembering. Iran's own retaliatory action against a British target appears to have removed whatever reluctance existed in London about hosting these bomber operations directly, rather than deterring further Western involvement, the way retaliation is traditionally intended to do. And once that basing decision was made, Fairford became the staging ground not just for B-1s, but for B-52s as well, following Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's statement that airstrikes on Iran would surge dramatically, with Forbes reporting the Air Force maintains 76 B-52H Stratofortress bombers in its total inventory, 58 active, 18 in reserve, giving planners a genuinely comprehensive strategic bomber commitment to this single theater. I want to address how a strike like the IRGC bunker mission is generally treated under international law, because it's a meaningfully different category than some of the infrastructure targeting controversies I've covered elsewhere in this war. Striking senior military leadership actively engaged in directing a war is generally treated very differently under the laws of armed conflict than striking civilian infrastructure with heavy civilian dependency. Precisely because military commanders directing active operations are considered legitimate military objectives in a way that a bridge or power plant serving millions of civilians is not, even when that infrastructure carries some tangential military utility. That distinction is likely why this specific bunker strike hasn't generated anywhere near the level of public controversy that some infrastructure strikes covered elsewhere in this war have, even though it involved the exact same weapon system as the more contested Fordow strikes. Around the same period as some of these operations, images of a stealth flying wing aircraft spotted at Larissa Air Base in Greece were initially identified by observers as a B-2, potentially suggesting forward staging related to Iran operations. Analysts later suggested it was more likely the classified RQ-180 reconnaissance drone rather than an actual B-2. That episode illustrates just how closely open-source analysts have tracked every possible signal of B-2 movement throughout this war, given how rare and significant every actual mission involving this aircraft has turned out to be, and why detailed information about missions like the IRGC bunker strike tends to emerge gradually through reporting, rather than immediate government announcements. Looking at this whole arc together, I think it tells a clear story of adaptation. The war opened with the single most powerful, most scarce weapon in the arsenal used against the single hardest known target, backed by 15 years of dedicated intelligence work. Since then, planners have had to figure out how to sustain bunker-busting capability against a much wider range of targets without burning through an irreplaceable stockpile that won't be replenished until 2028. Hence the shift toward the B-1, the GBU-72, and mini-MOPs, a genuinely different strategic approach, trading maximum per weapon power for quantity and platform flexibility. I also think the way this capability has been used tells you something about how deliberately sequenced this entire air campaign has been. Suppress air defenses first, then expand which platforms and weapons can operate safely in that increasingly permissive environment. Reserve the scarcest, most powerful weapon for the hardest, most symbolically significant targets, and use the more numerous, more available weapons for everything else. That's a methodical, resource-conscious approach rather than an unlimited, indiscriminate one. And understanding that methodology is exactly what lets you interpret each new bomber and weapons story in this war as part of a coherent whole rather than a series of disconnected headlines. Whether that diversified toolkit is actually sufficient against something as deliberately over-engineered as Pickaxe Mountain remains the one genuinely open question left in this entire campaign. Iran spent years specifically studying what made Fordow vulnerable and engineering its successor facility to avoid repeating those same weaknesses, buried deeper with more rock and earth between the surface and the actual chambers than even Fordow had. Trump's own public language on that target has shifted between absolute commitment and softer, more conditional framing within the same interviews, which I think reflects genuine internal uncertainty about whether even this expanded, diversified bunker-busting toolkit can actually finish that specific job cleanly. So that's the complete bunker buster picture across this war. One confirmed strike on Fordow and Natanz, built on 15 years of intelligence work. A second confirmed strike on IRGC leadership, executed dynamically during a rescue operation. One disputed incident at Parchin that's never been fully clarified by either government. And now an entirely new weapon class rolling out via the B-1 openly from a UK base that almost didn't become available for this purpose at all. Layer in the stockpile constraints stretching to 2028. The unexploded ordnance concerns Iran has raised, and the sheer logistics of flying every single B-2 mission, nearly 14,000 miles round trip from Missouri. And you get a much fuller picture than any single strike report on its own could ever provide. I'll keep tracking this as Pickaxe Mountain remains the next major flashpoint, and I'll bring you the full story the moment there's confirmed movement on that specific target, whether that's a successful strike, a failed attempt, or continued restraint while planners keep weighing whether the current toolkit is actually adequate for a target this deliberately hardened. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and hit subscribe for the next update. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.